English language class. My name is Happiness Ndewe, and our topic for today is critical reading in the theme reading. Before we go into the body of our lesson for today, let's take a look at the objectives for this lesson. By the end of our class today, you should be able to define critical reading, list and explain the steps involved in critical reading, state the goals of critical reading, differentiate between facts and opinions, and identify facts and opinions from passages. Now let's go into our lesson. Have you ever asked yourself questions from a book you read or a passage you read? Have you ever pondered on what you read about from a book or an article or a material you saw somewhere? Now, having asked ourselves these questions, if your answer is yes, then you are a critical reader. That is, if you've ever asked yourself questions about what a text or passage you read is about, or if you've ever wondered what the intention of an author was concerning a book you read. If your answer is yes, then you are a critical reader. Now, let's talk about, or let's see what critical reading is all about. When we read critically, we do not just read carefully, but we engage in what we are reading by asking ourselves questions such as, what is the author trying to say? What is the main point the author has presented? Why did the author say what he said in the text? If you ask yourself these questions as you read a book or after you have read a book, then what you're doing is known as critical reading. You are reading critically. We read and try to understand what a text or passage talks about or really means. That is when we are doing critical reading, or when we are practicing the act of reading critically. So that's simply what critical reading is all about. When you do not just read a book carefully, when you do not just scan through a material or a book you are reading, you read it thoughtfully, asking yourself questions about what the author has presented in the book, asking yourself questions about what the author said, what it really means, trying to give yourself an interpretation of what a text or a passage is about. That is what we call critical reading. Now, still talking about critical reading, a person who reads critically is known as a critical reader. Here are some important things you, as a critical thinker or reader, need to reflect on as you read. Now, if you are a critical reader, or one way to identify a critical reader is that he or she focuses on what the text says. If you aspire to be a critical reader, or if you want to identify who a critical reader is, the person should be able to understand what the text says. If you want to be a critical reader, you should bear this in mind. That is, you should be able to write a summary of the passage or text. After you have read a text, you ask yourself, what is the text saying? What did the author say in the book or in the passage I have just read? And from that information, you as the critical reader should be able to draw a summary. Remember, in our previous lessons, we talked about summary writing. And we did say that summary writing is the process of putting down the main points from a larger writing. When you have a larger writing or a larger book or a text, you read it and then put down the main points, the most important details from that book or that passage you have read. When you put them down like that, what you have written down, which contains just the most important ideas from the main work, is known as your summary. So if you're a critical reader or if you want to practice critical reading, you should be able to know what the text is saying, and at the end of the day, draw your own summary. You should be able to understand what the text is saying such that you are able to write your own summary in your own words. So that is one. Next, you should bear in mind what the text describes. As a critical reader, you should be able to understand the text enough to use your own words and examples to compare and contrast it with other texts on the same topics. You should be able to know what that text or that passage you have read describes. What does it talk about? What is it explaining? And at the end of the day, you should be able to differentiate the content of that text you have read with the content of another material, perhaps which talks about the same topic. So as a critical reader, you must understand what the author is trying to explain or describe in his text, such that you can describe the same thing in your own words, and then contrast and compare that material with other books or materials on the same topic. The next one is the interpretation of the text. As a critical reader, you should be able to make your own meaning out of the text after reading and understanding it. Remember, I said earlier that critical reading is not just about reading a book or reading a passage carefully. When we read critically, we intend to put the information we have read in our minds. We intend to make meaning out of them. We intend to recall them from time to time. And so as a critical reader, you must be able to have your own interpretation of the text. You must be able to make your own interpretation, get your own meaning out of the text after reading and understanding it. Apart from what the author has said, how can you apply that information which you have gotten from the book or the passage you read? How can you apply it to something else, another event or another situation in life? How can you apply it to yourself? So a critical reader must also be able to get his or her own meaning from the text or passage that he or she reads. Now, another thing to note, very importantly, is the difference between facts and opinions. A critical reader must be able to differentiate between facts and the author's opinions. In every material, book or article or just a comprehension passage, you find information that are facts, and you also find information that are opinions. Now, let's look at the difference between facts and opinions. What are facts and what are opinions? And how can we identify them as we read? First of all, let's define facts. A fact is a piece of information that can be proven true through objective evidence. That is simply what a fact is. A piece of information that can be proven or that can be proven to be correct due to or as a result of objective evidence. There must be proof that that information is correct. There must be proof that that information or that piece of information is acceptable in the society or universally. Now, let's look at an example of a factual statement. At least 4 out of 5 adults will experience lower back pain at some point in their lives. This statement here is a fact. This is because medical research can confirm that it is true. If you see adults or if you see some adults, men or women, that are probably above 50 or 60, more often than not, you would find that a lot of them already have some knee pain, some back pain, waist pain, and all of that. It is a normal thing that happens as we grow older in age. It is normal for the waist or the joints, the knee, the back, and all those joints to ache at some point in our lives. That's why we see old men and women limping when they walk. You cannot stand up right. So this statement is a fact because medically it has been proven to be true. So this is a factual statement. So a fact is simply a piece of information that has been proven to be true. On the other hand, an opinion is a person's belief, judgment, or conclusion about a subject matter that cannot be objectively proved as true. This is just the opposite of a fact in a way. Opinions are simply a person's belief. It is more personal than general. An opinion or my opinion can be something I believe, something I think is true, but is not necessarily proven true. It has not been confirmed. It has not been proven true by research or by any other means. It is just my personal judgment or my personal belief or conclusion about a particular subject matter. So that is what an opinion is. For example, the best treatment for lower back pain is Panadol. This statement is an opinion because it has not been proven that Panadol is the best treatment for lower back pain. As a matter of fact, a lot of these old men and women who experience these pains on their backs, on their waist, and on their knees take Panadol and it does not help all the time. It does not help ease the pain. So we cannot factually say that this statement is correct. It is just said out of somebody's opinion. Maybe someone used Panadol and it worked. It may not work for the next person. So an opinion is simply somebody's belief, an individual or a group of people's belief or their conclusion about a subject matter. Now note that as critical readers, we should be able to identify facts and opinions from the materials we read. This is very important. We should be able to know when the author has stated a fact in his writing. We also should be able to know when it is the author's opinion speaking to us. We should be able to know when the author is simply passing on his opinion to us or to the readers. And we should also know when he is making factual statements. So differentiating facts and opinions as we read, as critical readers, is a very important skill we should have. Now let's look at some goals of critical reading. What are the goals? What do we aim at when we read critically? The first one is to recognize the author's purposes. That is, what did the author have in mind when he wrote down that material or that text? Did he write it to entertain us or to inform us or to persuade us? In our previous class, we looked at the author's purpose and we talked about the author's purpose in writing, and we said there are three basic purposes: entertainment, persuasion, and information. So one of the things we strive to achieve as critical readers is determine the author's purpose from that text or material we are reading. So we need to recognize the author's purpose. Next, to understand the author's tone and mood. Every piece of writing has a tone, has a mood. From what you're reading, you can determine or you can tell if the author is angry. You can also tell if the author is happy. And this is as a result of the author's choice of words. Is he using angry words? Is he using happy words? Words that transfer some form of happiness to the readers? What kind of words is the author using? So we should also understand the author's tone and mood as we read critically. Next, we read critically to recognize bias. And bias is a piece of information influenced by the author's preconceived opinion. This is another goal of critical reading. We read to, differentiate bias from what the real information is. When we read critically, we can tell when an author is simply talking based on how he feels emotionally. Now, for example, if an author belongs to a particular political party and he's writing on the negative changes that have occurred in that society where he resides, and maybe the governor in office belongs to his political party, do you think that that author will be objective and fair enough to criticize that governor? I don't think he will. I think that he would write based on bias because he belongs to the same political party with the governor. And so he will not want to criticize that governor in his writing. So instead, he might give some false information. That is bias. When an author gives information influenced by his own preconceived opinion, maybe something that is not even true. So we read critically to recognize bias. Another goal for critical reading is to get the facts from a passage. We read to get the facts from a passage. We have something to learn from every material we pick up to read. And the more facts we gather, the more knowledge we add to ourselves. So this is another reason why we read critically, to gather facts, to add to our bank of information. Now, let's look at the critical reading process. When we read critically, a number of processes are involved. The following are 5 basic steps for critical reading. Critical reading is a process. It involves some activities. And the first one here is questioning. Then we have skimming or surveying. And then we have line-by-line reading. We also have recalling. And lastly, we have reviewing. So these are the 5 basic steps for critical reading. Now let's look at them one after the other. Questioning. What is questioning? Questioning simply has to do with asking questions. Now, before we read or before we begin to read, it is important that we have questions or sets of questions that will guide us. We should ask ourselves questions like, why am I reading this? This is because when we have a purpose to our reading, we will want to learn and remember certain information from what we have read. It is very important to write down questions as we read or before we begin to read. If you ask yourself why you want to read a particular text or passage, that knowledge will guide you to know what information to retain from that piece of writing. Now, here are other questions we can ask ourselves before reading critically. What do I already know about the subject matter? How can I relate what I have read to my own experiences? Having these questions written down will guide us to read critically, because as we read, we would subconsciously answer these questions, and that process is known as critical reading. The next process is skimming or surveying, and this has to do with reading through the passage quickly. It is also known as speed reading. We skim through the passage initially to get ourselves familiar with the gist of the passage, the text, or the material. As we've said, this just has to do with reading through the passage. It's the first reading of the passage or the text. And we basically read as fast as we can just to get the information in the passage. If it's a story, we read through the first time to get the gist or to get the basic information contained in the text or the passage. Surveying a passage or text is important because it gives us a foundational understanding of the text before we begin to critique what we are reading, before we begin to look in detail at what is presented or what we have to read. We read it first of all to get the basic information or the gist of the passage. So that is what is known as skimming or surveying. And then we move on to line by line reading. This is the next step of critical reading. As its name implies, this process has to do with reading through the text or passage carefully and slowly. Remember that skimming or surveying has to do with reading through the passage or the text as quickly as possible, especially if it's a long one. But line by line reading is the process of reading through that passage carefully and slowly, line by line. At this point, we analyze the passage and carefully consider the meaning of what the author is trying to pass across to his readers. We look at the passage carefully. That is what we mean by analyze. We look at it carefully. What is the author trying to say? What meaning has he passed on to me? These are questions we should ask ourselves. And then we consider that meaning and look at what he's trying to pass across to us. So this is what line by line reading entails. We also try to determine the author's purpose from the content of the passage, and it helps us draw better conclusions from our critical reading. This is another thing we do when we are reading line by line. We try to determine what the author's intention for writing that passage was. Was he writing to entertain? Was he writing to inform? Was he writing to persuade you? Or did he have these three purposes in mind as he was writing? So we ask ourselves these questions as we read line by line. The next thing to do is recalling. And recalling is a process that has to do with thinking about what we have read and writing down the main points or key points from the passage or text. After we have read line by line, we recall what we have read. We think about what we have read, and then we put down the main points from that text or from that passage we have read. And this is also known as summary writing or summarizing. Summary writing is simply putting down the main points or the key points from a particular passage, simply putting it down in your own words. We call that summarizing or summary writing, as we have learned in our previous lessons. Now, it's also very important for us to make efforts to recall what we have read from time to time, because there's always the tendency to forget. If we do not recall what we have read from a text, we might forget it. Just like we have to read our books to pass our exams. If we do not read, we'll get into the exam hall and forget the answer to certain questions. So it's good for us to recall or bring to remembrance what we have read from a text or passage from time to time. It is important that we write down the key points in our own words, as it will help us to better remember and retain the vital information from the passage. Now, most of us, when we read, we have jotters that we jot down what we have read in. It's very good for us to jot down such information in our own words and not necessarily with the words the author used in that book or in that text. This is because when you write down the main points in your own words, it sticks to your mind better. You remember the words you used to write them down. So that way, recalling it becomes easy. Recalling it becomes something that you do not fight with. So it's important for us to write down the key points of the passage in our own words, in our own sentences. Now, this is the final stage of critical reading. We started by asking ourselves questions. What does the author mean by what he said in the text? And then we go on to scan or skim through the text. And then we do line-by-line reading, paying attention to the information the author has presented in the text. And then we go on to recall what the author has said, what we have read. After understanding it, we recall it, that is, we remember it, and then put it down in our own words. Now, after doing all of that, we review what we have written down. While reviewing, we may ask ourselves the following questions. Did I identify all the main points? Did I understand the author's ideas? Did the author leave any gaps in knowledge about the subject matter? These are questions we should ask ourselves as we review. That thing you have written down, that thing you have jotted down from what you read, ask yourself questions based on it. Did I identify all the main points the author presented in the text? Did I write them down the way they appeared? Did I exhaust the passage? Did I read and really understand what I read? Does my writing tally with what the author wrote in his book? So these are questions we should ask ourselves. And where possible, we should read the text again and cross-check the information we have gathered. If you ask yourselves these questions and find out that you did not exhaust the main points, that is, you didn't write down the main points from the passage you read, you didn't write them down while you were recalling. If you find out that you did not, then you can revisit the passage. You can read through the text again and gather as much information as you can gather. So this is what reviewing is all about. You're simply cross-checking what you have written down. The facts you gathered from the passage, which you have written down perhaps in your jotter, you're simply revisiting it. You're simply going through it over again to be sure that what you wrote down is what is contained in the text. To also be sure that the meaning you got from the text is correct. So these are things we do when we are involved in reviewing. That's the end of our lesson today on critical reading. Now let's remind ourselves of all we learned today. Today we defined critical reading and we said it has to do with asking ourselves questions about the content of a passage or text. We also discussed the basic steps. Involved in critical reading, and we said they are questioning, skimming, line-by-line reading, recalling, and reviewing. And then we differentiated between facts and opinions, and we said a fact is a piece of information that can be proven true through objective evidence. And lastly, we said an opinion is an author's belief or conclusion about a subject matter that cannot be proven as true. Now let's answer our only question for today. Our question for today says, pupils who attend private schools are more intelligent than those in government-owned schools. The statement above is dash. A, fact. B, opinion. The correct answer is B, opinion. In our lesson, we did say that an opinion is someone's belief or conclusion about a particular matter. And that belief or conclusion is not or has not been proven true. Now, this statement, pupils who attend private schools are more intelligent than those in government-owned schools, is an opinion because most pupils in government-owned schools may perform better or may be more intelligent than those in private schools. The fact that the school is a private school or government school does not or should not necessarily determine how intelligent the child should be. So it has not been proven true, therefore is not a fact. So the correct answer is B, opinion. Here we end our lesson today on critical reading. Thank you for watching and see you next time.